Welcome back to the M&M Discipleship Podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a disciple of Christ. We aim to look for God in our daily lives, be in His Word, and strive to live out the teachings of Jesus. This is Dakota Moody, and I am joined as always by my co-host, Michael Round. Michael, how are you doing this very cold morning?
Yeah, they recorded temperatures at -13, so I am thawing out. It's been
Yeah.
nice being in the warm office, but yeah, cold. How about you?
Luckily surprisingly, not having it as bad as you guys are, or as much of the country has had. Been quite temperate here in upstate South Carolina, so things have been quite okay here. A little bit cold, but it's not too bad overall. I mean, no snow or anything like that. Speaking of snow, you get some of that snow that you were prizing, you were wanting so much last week.
Yes. We got probably a little more than 5 inches, and so it was a good snow. And I'll
Yeah,
talk about it more later. It's just beautiful. And because it's been so cold, it's stuck around. So
yeah,
that's been nice. Usually, living in the South, it's gone by the afternoon it falls.
yeah,
But it's stuck around. It's still very
yeah,
white out there.
yeah. For you who has to only walk to the office, I'm sure this has been quite nice that not only you get snow, but it gets to stay around for you to see.
Yeah, well,
And
and we knew the storm was coming, so
yeah,
we got groceries ahead of time, and so we were prepared. Yeah, we haven't left the house, we haven't driven since before Sunday, or since we
all
did drive Sunday.
oh,
So,
did you? There you go. Yeah, all the stores been cleared out of milk and bread, I'm sure, throughout this country.
well,
So
and yeah, and so we went to South Carolina over last weekend, and we
yeah.
went to the grocery store ahead of that trip because we knew on Saturday it would be a nightmare.
Oh yeah.
So we were at the store, and Mackenzie actually did a grocery pickup, so that was Thursday, a couple of days before it even started. So
Before we
that
get too
was
deep
good.
into it, isn't milk a strange choice to get before a storm to get? Because you'd think like if the power goes down, there's not a worse thing to have than milk, right? Because there's nothing that's more like temperature needed that like there's nothing more that you need a refrigerator for than milk,
Yes,
right?
but if it's before a snowstorm, you can just stick it outside.
I suppose, but there's just such a rush on like milk and bread. I
Yeah.
never understood the milk. And this is by the way coming from somebody
Yes, a
who
milk drinker.
adores milk,
Yes.
right? Like I will drink milk breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and some of you just went ugh to that, but I love milk. Um,
And Dakota had a skill growing up too. He probably he had a skill for filling up the glass and getting as much milk as possible in the glass.
Absolutely.
That should be an Olympic sport.
Without spilling too, because
But
I
I
wouldn't
mean,
want to waste that's
oh yeah,
sweet
you'd always
sweet
slurp
milk.
at the top of it,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
make sure, and then pour a little more in, and but no, I mean, you use it for baking. A lot of people like it with their breakfast. If you got
Yes.
children, yeah, I mean, it has purposes. And if you want to make snow cream,
S- By the way, people, don't do it. Okay, don't do it. Like go take some snow from outside and just microwave it and see what color is in that liquid afterwards.
okay, that might be a good point.
Don't do it. Don't make snow. I don't care how much your grandparents did it. Don't do it. All right, we got too much nastiness in our atmosphere right now. Do not do it. Okay, there's a time in this country and in this world where you could just freely eat the snow, and that was fine. But we
Not
know
now.
better now. We know better now. Like that's the
I have
next the
not
next
heard that before. That's a new one to me.
do it. Well you got lots of snow outside. Take you a
Yeah.
cup, get you some snow,
Mm,
microwave it for like 30 seconds and look at the color of
mm,
the liquid in that cup. It's not going to be clear.
mm.
You think it's
Interesting.
going to be clear water. It is not. It is not going to be, and it is nasty. Oftentimes it's like black, and you don't want
Oh,
that. Yeah,
okay. Well,
it's
I'll give you an update on that one.
it's really nasty. Anyway, so instead of talking about how we have polluted God's creation, uh, let's talk about where we've seen God in His creation, in
Mm.
our world, in our lives. Michael, where have you seen God in your life this week?
Yeah, it's definitely been the storm, the weather, and immense cold. I mean, cold like I've probably never experienced. I mean, -13 this morning, as I said, at our community airport. So yeah, even the snow has like refrozen
Mm.
in a more than usual kind of way. But it's been beautiful with the white on everything, how peaceful snow is, and the Bible talks about how God allows the snow to fall. God shows Himself in the beauty that He's made, and especially in something like snow. So, what about you, man?
Absolutely, gotta definitely see God in that beauty that is snow, for sure. Where I have seen God this week is kind of an interesting place. We had a funeral this last Friday. One of our brothers in Christ has gone home, um, and after the service, there was I believe most of the time you'd call it a wake, like the after funeral time together. Is that what a wake would be considered? Um, Frankly, I
For the
haven't been enough.
candles,
I've been very privileged to not have been to enough funerals in my life to really know all the terminology. What would you call it?
I don't know. I mean,
Is that what it's
generally
called
just a
afterwards? The
meal for
wake?
the family, or I
Okay.
mean, I guess it
Well,
still could be a reception if the family is receiving visitors.
I suppose so at that point. Well, we had that at the building afterwards. We had the funeral was at the funeral home, and then we came back to the church building afterwards. And some of the family members who were out of town, as well as those who were part of the congregation, and many of the members of our congregation were here at that time afterwards. And I tell you, the kind of fellowship, love, community that I saw during that time afterwards, where it wasn't just people coming in feeling like they had to do their social obligation in the funeral and then leaving as soon as possible. It was people staying around for a couple hours and being together and fellowshipping and spending time together and loving that time with their brothers and sisters, even though it was admittedly a very, sad time. There was such a love and community in that it was hard to feel sad because of how much good things were going on and love and emotions that were being kind of put out there during that time. And it made me really happy to be here at this congregation, made me really happy to be a member of this congregation, the minister of this congregation, have my future here. But it made me really happy to be a disciple of Christ, to be a member of God's kingdom and experience that true bond of fellowship that I know that God created us to enjoy and created his people to have with one another. And that's certainly where I saw God this week is even in a sad moment, we found love and community. And that's, I think, the goal for God's church.
Mm. And two, like, right after that, you guys came over to a family from the church in South Carolina, the church at Golden Strip, and
Yeah.
there was a whole bunch of us got together, and I actually got to see Dakota, so that was kind of cool. But
More
kind of
fun and
continuing that
fellowship.
theme, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But fellowship among God's people
Yeah.
and special, and God's definitely created a special thing with the church,
Yeah.
and obviously he knew what he was doing.
Yeah. Even though I'm not a member of that congregation, getting to
Yeah, yeah,
come in
yeah.
there and spend time with fellow brothers and sisters that I've known for a long time. And that's always, a thing I've mentioned, I think, before on this podcast, or at least in general in life, is that we have infinitely more in common with those who we
Hmm.
have a relationship with Christ shared with. And
Yeah,
that's the thing, is that if you spend time with people who you have that relationship with, you will always have an enjoyable time of fellowship as compared to those who are outside of Christ.
yep,
And so, whether it was here with the congregation I'm currently with, that congregation there, or many other places, there's no better people to fellowship with than God's people.
yep,
Yep.
absolutely,
A great connection
absolutely.
there. Yep. So as we continue our look at our study of the Sermon on the Mount, we continue reading on. At this point, we've gotten kind of past the Lord's Prayer, and we're talking about the different ways in which Jesus is talking about how we should not be exploiting righteous behavior for our own honor, but instead in glorifying God. And today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. So, Michael, if you want to go ahead and read that passage and let us know your thoughts.
And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. So Jesus is continuing furthering the concept of when you are practicing your righteousness, don't do it in an outward, showy way to be seen by others. I mean, Jesus talks about earlier in Matthew 5 about practicing your righteousness so that other people glorify God. But in this scenario, people that are, oh man, I'm fasting and my life is so difficult to do this and I'm so dedicated to the Lord and all that, and it takes away from it. And Jesus says, you got your reward. You got what you wanted. People are praising you for that. So it's about God who sees in secret. So what thoughts do you have on this, Dakota?
Well, I think you kind of nailed it right on the head there. I think that's certainly the situation that he's talking about. Whereas, when we're practicing our righteousness before others, no, in order to just be seen by them, in order to get our reward here, then that's where our reward ends, is here. We're not doing it to please God in that way. And so that's certainly, I think, the main context for this passage. A quick thought that I have about this passage as well is this, and I know this is going to sound laughable coming from somebody who's 300 pounds, but I have never gotten more negative backlash to a sermon
Mm,
than when I talked about this passage. And this wasn't this congregation or even my last congregation, but a different time whenever I was preaching. And I talked about this passage, and I made notice of the fact that Jesus says, "And when you fast, not and if you fast." And the reason why I got such a negative pushback to this is that we in our 21st century, where we have food abundantly, where we never have to be without, where we have been kind of conditioned to have 3 meals a day, we are very hesitant to give that up and to fast and to kind of show the self-control necessary to say, instead of me eating my 3 meals a day, I'm going to take one of those out or two of those out potentially, saying I won't eat for a 24-hour period and I'm going to dedicate that time to God, dedicate that money that I was going to spend on that food to God, doing those sorts of things that can be a great benefit, a blessing for us to help us teach us self-control, and teach us sacrifice, where we could have that. This is why fasting was such an essential spiritual discipline, such a essential practice during Jesus' day, and continuing on throughout most of Christendom until really the 20th, 21st century. Right? This is something that we have just recently kind of given up, the idea that we would fast, that
mm,
Christians would fast. And it is not in the law that we must, it's not a law for us, it's not a command that we must fast. But when Jesus talked about fasting, he didn't kind of make it an if you fast. It was a
mm,
when you fast, because God's people have always fasted. And we see the example of this in the New Testament. I know in our church movement, we're especially partial to the book of Acts. Well, when they had to make tough decisions, what did they do?
mm,
They fasted and prayed together. And
mhm.
this is something that is still valuable for God's people today. And I think this is something for us to consider is absolutely the context this passage is talking about not practicing righteousness before other people in order to be praised by them. But I think another thing that we need to get from this is fasting is not dead. It should not be dead within our Christian lives. And it's something that we should consider because it has a lot of benefits to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's not too much to add to that. I think it also, like you said, it was so ingrained in their relationship with God that he can assume and when you fast. There is also the passage that talks, people, other Jews are questioning Jesus about his disciples and the fact that they don't fast. And he talked about a time when the bridegroom was gone, when he's going to leave, where they will fast. So yeah, there's definitely a need for that kind of thing. And the whole point being that when you do it, don't do it to be seen by others. And so as we circle back to that, so be thinking about that when you think about prayer, you think about fasting, you think about giving. It's not to be seen by others, but it's
Right.
to honor God and grow closer to Him.
Absolutely. And I think it is such a valuable spiritual discipline for us to practice, not only with food, but by the way, you can also fast in other areas as well, something that's important. Now, this is usually the first pushback I got for that sermon was people said, well, you can fast in other areas. And while I don't disagree with that, I think food fasting can be important for us to do, but you can fast in other areas. You can do a social media fast. You can do
Mhm.
different sorts of fasts in that way, just a phone fast in general, get away from those sorts of things. Whatever is separating you from God, you can certainly try to fast from to gain control over that situation. But I do think food fasting is also a foundational tool that we can use to help. Because once again, we can do that to not only build our own self control, but we can also learn sacrifice in that we can take the money we were going to spend on our own lunches,
Hmm.
give it to
Right.
somebody else, put it in the collection plate on Sunday, do those sorts of things. And 'cause that's the main thing, is this was not just for health benefits. This was
Mm.
a time in which they set aside for God. And we
Yes.
use that, and that's the key thing. If you're going to fast, don't do it just because you're trying to be healthy. Do it because you're going to try to glorify God with that time. So take that time, read scripture, take that time to pray, use that money to give it to God, do those sorts of things with that time
Mm.
if you're going to fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not downplaying the need to do fun things, to do hobbies, but that's one thing about Sabbath as well, or just resting in general, is, when we think of resting, we think of like vegging out on the couch watching TV.
Hmm.
And the whole purpose for that Sabbath was for rest from work, but there's also an element of dedication there. And so when we think about in general just resting, well, let's not just use rest, or let's just not have rest to completely separate ourselves from other things. Let's redeem it, make it spiritual,
Yeah.
as well as relaxing.
Yeah.
But I think fasting's kind of in that category, like you said, making sure that it's not just, I'm not eating, so now I have more time to play video games, or I have more time to do this or whatever, or I have more
Yeah.
money to spend on myself. Um, so
That's the biggest. I think that would be the biggest thing with that. Don't use that excess now on ourselves still,
yes.
because again, that doesn't really get to the heart of what the whole goal is supposed to be. Which again, I
Mhm.
think relates to what Jesus is
Yep.
talking about here. If we're using these things to not glorify God, then we're missing the point.
Yep, yep.
Let's do that.
And actually, I don't want to jump ahead of you, but transitioning to what we've read, this is like what happens worst case. So I've been reading through the Old Testament, and I finished the book of Judges a couple days ago. And as I was thinking about this, at the end of Judges, the very last verse of Judges, in Judges 21:25, it says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And that's kind of where we are in certain ways. Maybe not within Christianity, but everybody just does whatever's right in their own eyes. And you mean to tell me that I've got to tell myself no, like with fasting, or think about other things, giving, whatever. That's so far outside of our purview. And we as Christians recognize that it's not about doing what's right in our own eyes. But if you read the end of the book of Judges, some of the most wicked things that happen in all of the Bible are there, and they're very entertaining. Yeah, I've been reading 5 pages a day when I'm in the office through the Old Testament, and I couldn't put it down. It was moving, some very interesting stories because of how depraved they were,
Yeah.
because people were doing whatever was right in their own eyes. So we don't want to live that way. But that's what I've been reading. So yeah, what about you, man? What have you been reading?
Well, that's certainly some very good observation there at that point. That's certainly an issue that I think that mankind can often face because we want to do what we want to do. We don't
Oh
want other
yeah,
people to tell us what to do, and
it's
I think
easy.
that's from the very beginning that was been our issue is a pride issue that mankind has had for a very long time about wanting to do what we want to do and not what other people want us to do. And when that is the exact opposite of what God calls us to, is to give up of ourselves at that point. So it's a very good
Definitely.
observation. Continuing on with the lost art of disciple making, jumping forward a couple chapters, I think from last week. There is a chapter, chapter 7, that is the titled "The Workers Are Still Few," and the context of this is we know that of course when Jesus talks about the harvest, he says the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few, and his context was is that every Christian should become a disciple. It's the way it works. Every Christian should become a disciple. Just because somebody is converted does not mean that they are yet a disciple. However, not every disciple is a worker, right? There's two
Mm,
different things in that. And what he means by that is that every Christian should be a disciple. Every Christian should be dedicated to prayer, to God's word, to fellowship, those basic essential things that make Christians Christians, right? That's the essential things that a disciple does. And every Christian should do that. And he says every Christian should be part of that. But not every Christian is going to be a worker. Not every
mm,
Christian is going to lead a discipleship group. Not every Christian is going to preach and teach and lead a Bible class. Not every Christian is going to lead an evangelical ministry. Not every Christian is going to do that. And so there's a difference between disciples and workers, because there is, all workers are disciples, but not all disciples are workers. And when we try to make every disciple a worker, well, then you can have some real issues, right? Because some people just are not led to lead, are not led to be in those kind of positions. That doesn't mean that they're not great and important, because there's many disciples who do a lot of things behind the scenes that the workers are not. They're still working in their own way, but they're not the workers that are leading in these kind of areas, but they're essential to the work of the church.
That's interesting. So is that the language he uses as worker and disciple?
Yes, that's what he uses. Because when he talks about disciples are people who are not only going to be able to be fully discipled themselves, but also can help to disciple others. But that doesn't mean that they're going to like lead a discipleship group, or they're going to go
Okay, I
out
see
and
what you're saying. Yep.
spearhead a ministry. But they
Yep,
can
yep.
still, and they should still be talking to others about their faith, be able to help other people come to conversion. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be like leading a ministry, right? Like they can talk to somebody one-on-one about this, about their discipleship to Christ and how they should also come to Christ. But there's a difference between being a worker and being a disciple at that point. And that's the
Okay, yeah.
line that he draws in the sand. And I think this is important for us, because right now in churches, a lot of times we don't even have disciples. But when we do have disciples, a lot of times, if we want to try to fit every disciple we have into workers, then it can become a problem. We should be trying to build up disciples of all people. And then from that point, you should also be looking at, okay, who's going to be the workers? Because you can try to pigeonhole everybody in that. It's not going to work.
Right,
Some
right.
people have different talents and gifts and abilities, and they and each should be used in their own way.
Absolutely. And that's a classic classic case of different parts of the body. You know, you have people that are leading, but I think that's a valid point. And the church needs followers. You know, not everybody can be a preacher. Not everybody can lead singing. Not everybody can pray. The church needs people to follow and to get behind the right kind of leaders. So yeah, that's an important thing. And but all, you know, not saying that, you know, the title and label of disciple is not good enough. It's just distinction between different parts of the body.
No, we should all strive to have that that marker as a disciple, if we can help it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything else from what you're reading, or any other final words?
No,
Nothing
sir.
to you.
I just appreciate this again. And for all those out there, as always, if you are enjoying this, make sure to share it with your friends and family. Find us on Apple Podcast or Spotify if you're not already listening through that avenue. For those of you who have been watching the video cast today, I'm sorry I keep having to blow my nose. 'Tis the season, as it were.
Yeah.
In that way. But for those of you who are on the podcast, you were blissfully ignorant of such things, and so enjoy the fact that you didn't have to watch me blow my nose a bunch of times. But please,
Well,
like,
that's it.
go ahead.
I would say, yeah, however you like to listen. So I know I don't enjoy listening to things on Facebook all the time. And so yeah, podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, those might be a better format for you if you're interested in that. But we thank you for joining us today on the M&M Discipleship Podcast. Until next time, let's look for God in our daily lives, learn from his word, and strive to live out the teachings of Jesus. Have a blessed day.